All right. I don't often present, so I use the opportunity of being an organizer to put myself on the program and being able to talk about something that has to do with stakeholder value. I got my attention to this topic because I'm going to retire soon. And then discussing with my pension fund manager, I realized I'd been had by my institution, so I decided to delve this a bit deeper and realized that there were some kind of strange things going on there. So, there's, oh yeah, that I'm able to do. That's right. So the issue there that we will discuss is, first of all, we do have an aging world in many developed countries, which has an impact on the influence of older people in pension fund management. The second, how can we address this? Well, maybe giving beneficiaries a choice, because in most pension funds, the beneficiaries have not much to say. They can maybe choose a plan, but normally not in the pension funds like we discussed. And then how can we implement this thing? So let me go about the first thing. So in most largest funds, which are in developed countries, what you can see now is that they have a cohort of people that are insured, which live longer and longer. And at the same time, in those countries, the birth rates goes down. So that has as a necessary correlation that at some time you'll have to make more payouts without having the younger generation who doesn't know exactly what they're doing anyway and paying for the older ones, right? And this little big game has been going on for some times, and especially if you look at some studies showing that actually the way that the fund is funded and the way it is managed is influenced by the older generation, not by the younger one, which means, of course, that they are interested in cashing in when they retire, and the baby boomers or the guys behind even that will get what is left. And we have evidence of underfunding, actually, of those funds. Now, they have been able to cover it up for a while because at some time they did some diversification in this period of time going up to 2010. But increasingly, we know that it's hard to beat the market when you manage your fund, so we can expect them to plateau somewhere. And today, what we see is that the performance is going worse. And what you can see as unrealistic is a fund like Calpers is still expecting to do an 8% return annually over the next 20 years. Which, yes, if inflation goes up dramatically, maybe that will happen, but pretending that in the current environment is a bit hard to swallow, especially because pension fund experts have said maybe 10 years ago already that 0% would be more realistic in today's environment. So we have a problem, right? When you promise 8% and the real world situation is 0%, sometimes something will have to give. And that's where I started getting interested in this topic. Now, there are, as you know, and you're here a bit more familiar with this, so I don't necessarily need to go more in details, we have two types of pension funds. The ones where the defined contribution one, which is also the dominant one in the US, that is, you pay, and then once you have paid at the exit, you get what you have paid in, and then you convert that into an annual or a monthly return. Whereas in the defined benefit system, you are guaranteed a certain return. Now, on paper, it might be that it looks better for the beneficiaries to have defined benefits than a defined contribution. In my own little situation, we moved from defined contribution to defined benefits, and it cost me $500,000, so that was not that great, on paper at least. So you can play the game. I'm not complaining in the sense it worked out, but my financial advisor said that this was the cost it was. So in the defined benefit approach, as I said, the pension fund bears the risk, they promise something, and the result of this is that you pay out more than you should because you have promised some benefits, and you don't want to antagonize the older generation. And anyway, as a manager of the pension fund, you'll be retired when the guys have no money left, so who cares? Right? So that's the game that is played, whereas with defined contribution, the beneficiaries do bear the risk. However, there is some risk that people expect the same returns than in defined benefits. So you might have a revolt by guys if to suddenly say, well, you have defined contribution, but you're going to get half what you expected. There is going to be at least some political reaction. So what has happened around the world is that people or pension funds have tried to start fix things. So how do you fix things? Well, one way is to say, well, we abandon the idea of defined benefits and we convert to something which is a robust defined contribution, because there you can say to people, that's what you contribute, and you provide some more transparency, and you have less problems than that. Now, then you put more a burden of the individuals, and you might have, as a consequence of the adjustment, a retirement funding gap, which means that you get less than you were expecting. What is more fashionable now is to do that in a covert way. And how can you cheat your future retirees? Well, there are two good ways of doing this. First, which I've seen a very sophisticated financial institution doing, is you say, well, what we are doing is, it's hard to manage this money. So when you retire, we give you now a pension, which is 1/3 of what you expected. And we give you the capital that is left, which is maybe a substantial amount of money, and you live with this, and it's your problem, not our problem. Okay? And then, because the amount is relatively substantial, unless you're a bit sophisticated, you don't realize you have been had. So that's way one. The way two is to just play with the conversion rates. That is, once you have the capital and then you have to pay out, well, you can start saying, well, we may have payment, but we either limit it in time or we make it as it is a high amount, but we expect your expectancy to be 5 years or 2.5 years, but instead of the 30 that you still have to live, etc. So it is kind of playing the game. So it's kind of hiding what is going on. So those are the short-term fixes, but they might not have necessarily a future, because I expect people to get a little bit more sophisticated. So you see other techniques than just fixing it on the short term. It's also what people call gambling for redemption. So you start taking high risks to cover the shorting or the shortage of the insufficient funding that you might have. Now, as a manager, you might not like that, because if you start gambling, the risk is that pretty soon people will realize what's going on, so your time horizon might be longer as a manager than you would like to have, considering the risk you have. The second thing what you could do is you could exercise voice. So you can have pension funds playing a more activist role. Now, one argument against this is to say they're normally diversified, and if you're diversified, why be an activist? Actually, there's some evidence showing that even large pension funds that are diversified play also an activist role. But there are also limitations in how much you can do that. If you have some underfunding, that might be okay. If you have severe underfunding, which might, I think, be the case in many instances, this is not going to play. So one way out of this would be to, and this would be the topic of this paper, which is still in progress, is to give beneficiaries a say. And how can you give them a say? Well, you can let them express their preferences on the portfolio of assets that is managed by the pension fund. And that has several advantages. First of all, from a financial and economic perspective, it takes some burden off the fund manager and puts some responsibility on top of the beneficiaries. And from a political perspective, it reduces the backlash effect you might have once you realize that you have less in the bank than you expected in the first place. So it reduces future huge problems that might arise when the general population realizes what is going on. Now here, you can give choices, and the choices which I'll come back to can be financial or non-financial. Financial would be more shareholder value. Non-financial would be more stakeholder value. And of course, your view on how you want to make your choices might depend. If you are 65 and have cancer in a terminal way, you are going to make maybe different choices, or if you're 60 or whatever, than otherwise. But some people are also risk preferring it, so they might choose it differently than it is. And as we know, with 401k plans in the US and other ways, in Switzerland, we have also so-called third pillar, people are not unable to do those choices. Now, we might want to help them a bit here, but it's not stupid, at least at the stage of this early thing. So the proposal here would be, how do you frame this? Well, you would continue to trust the pension funds that we have, but we would permit people to make some shareholder or stakeholder value choices. The shareholder value would have more financial preferences. The stakeholder value would be that you would make some non-financial decisions. And there you could take into account the existing asset allocation in pension funds around the world. So what you see is that they are less than in the past, but still invested quite heavily in equity. They have some bonds investments. They do have some cash. And then the 24 others is generally real estate or alternative investments. So what you can do here when you give a choice, and that would be the simplest and easiest choice, is to say, well, you as a pension fund beneficiary, you can decide about what the asset allocation is, which would mean the younger generation would probably choose more equity. The older generation would choose more bonds, and you would reduce the conflict between the older and the newer generation, because of course if you have to make more payouts, then you would go more to cash and bonds than into equity, which would be detrimental to the younger generation. So that's one way you could play with it. You would start deciding or saying something about the asset allocation. Now that might make the asset management or the management of the fund a bit more difficult, which is why the suggestion would be, by default, because we know that behaviorally it's better to have a default solution, so all the stupid guys will do nothing, potentially. Okay, so it continues like today. And potentially the somewhat smarter guys will decide that they would want to have a 20% choice over the asset allocation or potentially even individual stocks. Now the 20%, why? Well, even if you're stupid, you still have 80%, and those 80% might be better than what you have under the current system because managers will have to be paying more attention by having people looking a bit more. And more importantly, because you want the fund to be still manageable, that will be among the investments that the fund has made. You're not going to give orders onto the fund whatever to do. You can change the asset allocation. So you say, I want more equity, but it will be among the existing equity positions the fund has. Or you can say, I want more bonds, and it will be the same thing. Okay? Now, the question that you have here is, are you going to decide only about the asset allocation, or are you going to have also a say about individual stocks or individual bonds, which would be a more sophisticated and more interesting approach? And here I'm really reserving the discussion for a later slide. Now, this choice is to be limited, as I said, which is taking into account various cognitive limitations. And I think that it is known that people are not that smart, but I refuse to believe that the majority of the population is stupid. So at least within this little framework, that would be possible. And as I said, it would definitely reduce the conflict between the younger and the older generation. By the way, we had a Brexit comment this morning, and Brexit is clearly a conflict between the younger and the older generation. And you talked about democracies also. It has had already a huge impact in Switzerland, where they're talking about reducing the voting age and taking other measures because there is a realization that the younger generations in those votes are being quite often having to live with decisions that are detrimental to their interests. Now, whether this will work or not, I don't know, because the young don't go to vote in the first place, and the old ones have nothing to do, so that's what they do instead of playing bingo. So that's not this paper, another paper, potentially. Okay? Now, if you do the individual asset allocation, as I said, if you're young, you might take more shares. If you're older, you might take more bonds. What you are you limit the choice to a given asset class, right? You're not going into the stock picking. Now, we could do something else, and that would be you allow the beneficiaries to choose among the various equity holdings or the various bond holdings. So, for example, let's take that on the equity side, you do have 10 stocks, among which Coca-Cola, General Motors, and whatever. You could decide you don't like Coca-Cola because they pollute, whatever, what's bad for your health. Then you could eliminate Coca-Cola from the list and increase the shares of General Motors. That is interfering more with the management of the fund, that could be somewhat more a problem. It might be also that you're not sophisticated enough to know what you're doing, so you might need some additional information and indications, which is certainly something that you have to take into account. And I'll come back to two possible methods of investing, which is one, the scoreboard approach, which is an old thing that Michael Jensen from Harvard didn't like, but I'm going to go into the details, or the other one, which is kind of increasingly popular, which is called impact investing, that many banks are practicing, and I'll come back to a minute. Now, what you have to think a bit more about is, can you do both? Can you play on the asset allocation side, and can you play on the stock picking side? And without putting the discussion to later, I think you have to choose either or. You cannot then it becomes totally unmanageable and ungovernable. And let me take also that my fallback position is, if this sounds too complicated, you could just do the asset allocation. It would solve a lot of problems already to do it that way. Now, it is to do those, as I said, would be possible technically, but probably too complicated from fund management things. So how, if we assume that you don't do just asset allocation, but you can do also stock picking, there are two methods to permit people to realize whether they want to do a shareholder or a stakeholder investment. The first is the scoreboard approach. Here, it was something a bit complicated, developed in the early 90s, where basically a firm doesn't say necessarily only what they are doing from a shareholder maximization perspective, but you would also then say that to what extent you are also investing in human capital and other more stakeholder-oriented value. And you do a scoreboard compared to the strategy, and then you have an answer about how valuable the firm is from a stakeholder perspective and not only from a shareholder perspective. There's a cheap shot at this approach, that's to say, we know about shareholder value, you can evaluate with one number. If I start bringing you several numbers, it gets very complicated, and that's what Michael Jensen was saying. Now, if you look at the reality, there are thousands of firms who adopt this approach at the board level to understand what they are doing. And you can wonder why a normal human being could not also have this, especially if they have strong preferences. And here my cheap answer would be, no, this is a question of data, so let's run the experiment, and those who are prepared to take the risk will, the guys would be in charge of academia then, will do the empirical study, regressions and whatever, and see whether it's a good or not worse idea. The other one, which is more interesting, is impact investing. There, you don't look just at the governance of the firm, you look at the impact of your investment on education, on the environment, on health. And this is practiced by a lot of financial institutions which are interested in the side effects. So here we have relatively solid data, and that could be something that you could also provide as an indication for people to make some choices. Now, what would be, and that's potentially the more important point, what is the impact on fund management? So they could provide this data that we have mentioned. I think there could be no major obstacle on the management of the pension fund itself. There's one thing that pension fund managers will not like, is they will have to provide more transparency, because otherwise, up to now, nobody knows what's in there. That would permit beneficiaries, and just this would have already a disciplinary effect. When and how would you choose? Well, you choose probably once a year, because otherwise it has too much disruption on the management of the fund, and in 1 year you can adjust a bit and see what is going to happen. Now, what would be the impact of this new proposal? If you're negative about it, you'll say, well, if everybody starts making its picks, then we will have the management of the fund that will become impossible, because it totally put in disarray all the strategies you have followed. If you take it in an optimistic way, if you assume the major conflict is between older and newer generations, well, the newer will go equity, the older will go bonds, and the net effect might be a wash. What I don't know and have to think a bit more is, longer term, it will affect the behavior of pension funds. It will affect also the asset allocation. And what would be the pros and cons for the beneficiaries might need a bit more thinking before we make that kind of proposal. But it would be a proposal which would have, in short, 3 advantages. It would allow you to decide your own asset allocation at the very least. It would reduce the conflict between the older and the younger generation, and would potentially provide more transparency for pension funds and improve the governance of the pension funds by itself. And that is all I have to say at this stage of the project. Thank you.